Good morning. I'm glad y'all are here on the third day after probably a fun night last night. So I'm going to spend the next 45, 50 minutes talking about risk reduction measures and trying to convince you that you should do risk assessments, go beyond hazard and into risk. And I first wanted to mention that I have several co-authors on this. Joe's the only one here today, but I work with a pretty unique group, mostly up in Canada, but also down here in the States. I'm going to mention a lot about Alex Strauss's work. He just completed his PhD at the University of British Columbia in risk, specifically mostly with debris flows, and has informed a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. So if you haven't read his papers or his PhD, it's really informative. And then obviously Joe here with us, and then Sufia Zabraki, Hazel Wong, and Emily Mark. And I really appreciate all the help that they've given us. So I want to start though with land acknowledgement, just appreciating that we're on the traditional territory of the Washoe people. And in Canada, this is something that is very formative in terms of what we do day to day with our work in debris flows. And so I work with Indigenous communities, primarily in British Columbia, and the integration of Indigenous knowledge is becoming more and more commonplace within our work. And we're being required to actually engage with those Indigenous communities. And so on the left here, you can see some text from one of the chiefs within the community that was affected by a wildfire in 2017. And this is a really common understanding that we have within our community, is that the fires are getting larger and they're getting more severe. But it's not just because of climate change. It's because we have seen the banning of cultural burning practices that were very common with Indigenous communities. And they were essentially taking these landscapes and revitalizing them through fire, through good fire. And with the banning of that under the Indian Act, we saw that there was increased fuel loading in the forests. And we also saw that we were beginning to plant single stand species for harvesting. And with that, we saw our fires getting larger and larger. And so now the land is turning on us in that way. And on the right image, you can see a community that I work with. If you look at the name there, Lytton First Nation, you'll recognize that Lytton, the village of Lytton, burned down in 2021 during a wildfire. The whole town burned to the ground in about 45 minutes. And there were 2 fatalities that resulted from that. And that community is the center of a largely Indigenous population, which is Lytton First Nation. And you can see here that they're revitalizing that cultural burning practice to reduce the fuel load in their communities. So why am I up here? Why is a consultant from Canada coming to talk to you about post-wildfire debris flows? The first thing that you have to understand is that the post-wildfire community in Canada is particularly small. I think maybe now we could fit around 2 tables. I think when Tim was working in this, probably 1 table. Does that sound about right? So we're small, but we're mighty. And mostly consultants are the ones that are doing post-wildfire assessments in the province. So we are going out and doing these risk assessments on behalf of the province to talk to the communities. And you can see here an example of one of the post-wildfire debris flows that we've seen. We're seeing these in increasing number. And that's an example from 2022, where we've seen some of the largest post-wildfire debris flows in BC's recorded history. And on the right, these are the communities that I work with. They're largely Indigenous populations, but I also work with regional districts. And I'm most at home talking to communities over cups of coffee and over dinners about how we can reduce climate change effects moving forward. So I don't just look at post-wildfire debris flows, I also look at things like floods, things like landslides, and integrate that together into community risk assessments. So what I want to talk about, so I'm going to try and walk you through. I am a geoscientist, and I don't love math. But I'm going to try and walk you through a math exercise of how to evaluate risks, specifically for life loss. And then I'm going to talk about how we can use that information to inform risk management. And then I'm going to give you some of the lessons learned, again, largely from Alex's work, but some lessons learned in how we do debris flow risk and what we've gotten wrong over the years and maybe where we need to move forward. So the first thing, let's do some math at 9 a.m. So why are we doing this? Why do we do a risk assessment? Why do we formalize this into something? So these are a list of questions that we often get asked. Is my community safe enough? Should we develop here? Should we put in risk reduction measures? But you can't really answer these questions unless you talk not only about the hazard, but you also talk about what's being affected by the hazard. And on the right, you can see a bunch of graphics, and this has all been put together by Sofia Zaraki. And the reference there is the risk assessment chapter in the debris flow book. So I would highly recommend if you're doing this, that's like a really important resource right now. But we are often asked to say, okay, once we've done that, we know that there's a lot of population exposed. We know there's a lot of road exposed. What are the sites that are most important to take a look at? And how do we reduce those risks? How do we do cost-effective mitigation measures? And you can't do that without doing that math behind all of the risks and the damages that are associated with it. And then last bullet points here, we're going to return to those about should we evacuate people? And when can evacuees return home? And so those are some of the hardest decisions that we have to make as professionals. So a risk assessment is a step-by-step process. You can see this graph here just talking about the hazards. So whether we have something that triggers, in this case, a debris flow, whether or not it does initiate, we've been talking a lot about with the rainfall triggering processes. And then whether it reaches what we typically call an element at risk or a valued asset. And then if it causes loss or doesn't cause loss. And then those three categories of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability are something I'll return to over the course of this talk. And so the risk assessment can be used to quantify this threat from post-wildfire debris flows, but I also wanted to mention this is the same procedure that you would use for post-wildfire debris floods and floods as well. Okay, so how do we do this? It's pretty simple. It's only 4 terms. The devil's in the details, of course, of all of this. But we take the hazard probability, the spatial probability, temporal probability, and the vulnerability of that thing. And all of those terms are from 0 to 1. And we assign a likelihood to each of those. And we're going to consider the case of estimating the annual likelihood of someone dying in this debris flow. Now, I just want to put the caveat that this is sounding very crude, and it's sometimes found very morbid. But it is something that we do on a day-to-day basis, but I always want us to make sure that we're humanizing these numbers, right? So we don't take the human out of the science of this. So the first thing that we do is that we estimate the likelihood of that triggering condition. So we're looking at maybe a 5-year rainfall. So a 20% annual likelihood. And then that basin in particular has a 60% likelihood of initiating a debris flow. So multiply those together, you've got just above a 10% annual probability. You then, in this case, have run a runout model and you've done some field assessments and you've determined that the house that we're looking at in particular has a 90% chance of being inundated by a debris flow. You talk about the people that are in that building and that you learn that they live there full time. So temporal probability is 70%. Even though they live there full time, they might be commuting or they might be away, they might be at work. And so it's a rough approximate average. You then estimate if that debris flow reaches that building, what is the chance somebody is going to die? And this number is often thought of to be 1 or close to 1, but most of the data that we have is suggesting that it's much lower than that. There are still significant injuries, but in general, it falls somewhere around less than 0.5. And I know that's work that Katie's group is doing on this, as well as our group up north in Canada as well. So when you multiply all those things together, there's about a 1 in 33 chance annual likelihood that somebody is going to die in a post-wildfire debris flow in this situation. This is a very high number. And this is probably about the maximum credible limit that I would suggest that this is. So it's on the upper end. That's all of the factors are aligning together in order to get this likelihood of this occurring. And I'm going to introduce this term here called micromorts. This is something that Alex has talked a lot about, which is a way of estimating annual likelihood of death or daily likelihood of death. And it's very common in the medical community. And why we do this is because when we translate this information into those day-to-day terms that are more common in the medical community, is that we can take that risk and compare it to our everyday risks in real life. And I'll provide some examples of that. Alex claims that it's easier to do the math. I have days where I agree with him and days that I don't agree with him. But what I would say in working with communities is that if you show a community something with a scientific notation, their eyes glaze over, and to be frank, mine does as well. Doing the math on scientific notation and with lots of zeros is actually very difficult for someone to understand. So as much as you can, try and reduce the complexity of the numbers that you report. And your risk of dying, a dramatic death per day, is about 1 micromort. Just a fun fact to start the morning. Okay, so how does the risk of a post-wildfire debris flow compare to our everyday risks? So I'm going to show you this graph. I've got a bunch of data points developed from Alex and Scott's work, as well as some statistics from common occupational hazards in the US, and then also some recreational hazards, because most of us like to do kind of more higher risk activities. And then I'm also going to talk about voluntary risks, involuntary, and then also occupational hazards. Now, I'm going to walk through this because it's a bit of a complicated graph. It's log distributed, so know also that the risks that are on the left side of the diagram are much, much lower than they are on the right side of the diagram. So on the very far left, what you should recognize is overall landslide risk in the US is very low for the entire population. That is something that Alex has noted in Canada and the US, and it is something to recognize in terms of what we do moving forward. But I'll talk about in the specific examples of post-wildfire debris flows, they can be much higher. You also have commonly accepted thresholds around things like drowning and motor vehicle incidents, things that we do on a day-to-day basis. You've got other accidents and unintentional injuries. A really good data point for comparison was COVID in 2020 in the US. And then you've got all causes of dying at different ages there. So you can see that as you get older, you tend to have, or you have a higher likelihood of dying anyways. So that's what that point is showing. Now, how does that compare to recreational risks? You can see that those are on the far left of the diagram. Now, this is per day statistic, and these are developed for a different range of activities. So you've got things like downhill skiing, skydiving, backcountry skiing. And so if you do those more often, perhaps you have a slightly higher risk than that, but that's about the daily average. We then look at things that are occupational hazards that we have more regulated industries around, and certain types of occupations are riskier than others. So things like farming, construction are riskier, and those are US statistics. I know I'm mixing countries here, but those are US statistics specifically. So where do we plot? In that hypothetical example, we're plotting way over here. So disproportionately high risk in that one example. Now, it may be disproportionately high risk, but when I found that number, it made a few things click in my head. It made me realize that the risks that people are facing in post-wildfire debris flows between the ages of 60 and 85 are about compared to what they face on a day-to-day basis of all other causes. And it made me have a lot more empathy towards some of the really hard conversations that we have about evacuating people who have been there a very long time. Because compared to things like cancer and heart attacks and other causes of death, they're about the same as what they would face in a post-wildfire debris flow. Now, obviously, as you get younger, those risks become larger and further apart and are disproportionately, in terms of myself, I'm kind of approaching that age 40, so it's much higher than I would be exposed to my background risk. But it is something to think about, is that you want to make these comparisons to people's everyday risks. Now, these are the commonly published thresholds of acceptable landslide risk. And Alex's work has shown that when we use those, they are often unachievable in terms of existing buildings. They only really work when you have a new development where perhaps you have a very high risk or you want to be controlling something, maybe a very unlikely event that has significant consequences. We're going to come back to this later, and there's a reason I'm using the words acceptable in there, but recognizing that this is the literature tends to be when you compare it to standards like Hong Kong, or District of North Vancouver, we find that these lines are very hard to achieve and get risk down to that level. So how does this risk compare to non-wildfire debris flows? So typically, your hazard likelihood is much lower. And so on the right there, on the left you can see the post-wildfire example, and then on the right you've got the non-wildfire. But we've got a 1 in 100 debris flow event. And so you can see that the overall risk is about 10 times lower. So we're beginning to notch that down. But in the case of post-wildfire debris flows, particularly for sites where maybe it's a fire, what was the term we use, fire conditioned landscape or others, typically the volumes in post-wildfire debris flows are much larger. So when you compare that to non-wildfire, you also have to adjust the spatial impact probability and the vulnerability. And so you can see now we're pushing that risk number lower and lower. And the example that was pointed out yesterday about producing, say, maps that are about 100-year rainfall, you want to be thinking when you're producing those maps, not only about hazard likelihood, but ultimately what this number means. Because you can see that as you decrease the hazard likelihood, you're getting lower and lower on the risk. And so if you're producing these maps that are showing, here's the 100-year scenario, you might be distracting from what is a more likely scenario that has a much higher risk. And there's conversations to be had about what do you mitigate to, and what is affordable to mitigate to and appropriate to mitigate to. So Alex gave a talk last year at DFMH, where he looked at a range of typical debris flows in British Columbia. And so you can see that plotted there on the bottom. So that's about the typical risk range that we've got. And then I've done some back of the envelope calculations to look at what's the potential range of what I think is acceptable, or at least the terms that we would consider for post-wildfire debris flows. And so you can see that it's a big range, but the important thing to note there is that it's a step change up in terms of the amount of risk. And so when we're looking at a house, maybe that's near the fan apex, you might be expecting the risk in a non-wildfire scenario to be about here, and then a wildfire scenario, it moves all the way up here. But typically, most of the risk falls somewhere in here, and you're moving up at least an order of magnitude, if not 2 orders of magnitude. So we talked a little about life loss, but in my work, we also use risk assessments for other values. So this is an example that's coming out later this year from the Pacific Salmon Foundation. This is a risk assessment procedure for post-wildfire risks to salmon. So we've got ecological values in this system, and apologies, it's a little blurry on this chart here, but it's talking about sedimentation on spawning beds, it's talking about turbidity, loss of habitat, and quantifying all of those risks to those different values. So you can walk through that same risk assessment procedure, and that's what this document will show, is how we can do that risk assessment in order to guide some of the restoration processes. So watch this space moving forward. We can also estimate group risk. Now, I'm going to try and do a show of hands. Has anybody tried to do a group risk estimation? 2 people in this audience. Okay. It is not easy to do group risk. Individual risk for homes is pretty easy, but group risk is quite complicated. You're looking at things like temporal likelihood. You're looking at different kinds of building structures with different vulnerabilities. You're looking also at the types of population that are exposed. So what is the age range of those? And so there's a lot of different factors that go into this. But group risk is something that you can use to justify whether or not it's appropriate to do large capital expenditures. So looking at, should we build a $10 million debris flow berm or deflection, sedimentation basin? So you can step through all of those exact same pieces, but then you sum them together to get a total risk for the entire group. And we change the question, instead of the likelihood of one person dying, to how many people could be killed per year on average by the hazard. And it's a better way of comparing those risks. Okay, so what do we do moving forward? How do we take this information and turn it into risk management? So there are a few different ways that you can manage risk, and we'll bring up kind of those 3 different factors here. We've got the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability. And I'm going to add in a different part here. But in my experience in BC, it is actually very hard to reduce the hazard in an emergency situation. I know you've had a lot of experience in terms of mulching and other mechanisms, but we find it quite difficult to get that implemented quite quickly in our communities. So often that's something that we can't reduce the likelihood of the hazard occurring. But what we can do is we can reduce exposure and we can reduce vulnerability. We can also educate the public in terms of those. So we'll talk about a few examples of those. So commonly used terms we'll see is like evacuations, deflection structures, which can work both for exposure reduction and vulnerability. And then we've also got policy zones or rebuilding policies as well, and those are slightly different. So I'll kind of step through this in terms of what I look at in terms of taking that risk number and then turning it into what needs to happen next. And just clarifying that in Canada, we don't have a setup or as robust of an emergency management program. And so often these risk reduction measures are put onto the property owners. So it's something that we have to think about a lot, but I think this is a framework that you can use to guide some of your decisions. So in this example, risk is probably less than 10, probably less than 50, something that's relatively low. And you can see that there's a picnic table next to that RV, and this little debris flood hasn't moved that picnic table. So we know impact pressures are pretty low. We also would probably say here that life safety threats are pretty low. So the consequences are largely going to be economic. And in this case, the risk reduction measures are going to be pretty cheap. They're going to be things like sandbags, HESCO barriers. So implementing those is pretty cost effective. And for the cost of reducing the economic risk, they're going to be about equal. So what you put in there is going to be about what you save. Where it begins to get a bit tricky is where you've got the middle ground, where risk is higher, not hugely high, but higher. And I'm gonna say that that's probably starting to begin at about 1,000 cubic meters for debris flows. Consequences are still primarily economic. This is just a few, I'm gonna use a word here, centimeters of debris coming across the channel, and it's also coming across at a low velocity. So the life threats are pretty low. But there's still a chance, depending on the circumstances, and often where luck comes to play here. So if it's a bedroom window that's facing upslope, if it's something like a poorly constructed building, that's where you tend to get those very rare fatalities occurring. Or I'll talk a little bit later about somebody driving through that debris field. So you might be able to mitigate this probably pretty easily. And this is where the benefits of putting that in place are quite outweighed by the cost. So putting in a deflection berm is going to move that away from that house. And it probably could be implemented by the property owner, maybe through insurance, but probably also through emergency management. When we begin to get into larger volumes with faster flows and deeper flows, this is where risk becomes very high. And the size of these debris flows and the risk reductions that would appropriately reduce the vulnerability of that structure or the exposure of those people are probably cost prohibitive. So in that case, what we're left with is the difficult decision about whether somebody should remain in that house. And I know that you've got a more well-developed emergency management and warning system down here, but it is something that we find very difficult to manage primarily through evacuations. So it is something to think about is this risk being disproportionately borne by the homeowner, and is it appropriate for them to be able to put in those measures? And the time factor. We don't have enough time to do this typically in a post-wildfire situation. Now, we've had a lot of talks this week also about pre-fire assessments. And I hope you talked to Joe earlier this week about the work that we've been doing up in Canada about pre-fire risk assessments. So we're taking this beyond hazard and into risk. So we're increasing the likelihood of the event, but also the magnitude of the event and looking at the consequences of that. And I would say if you're going to do pre-fire assessments, take it to risk, but then compare it to baseline understanding. So the example that you see here, and I'm going to talk about cardinal sins that we're committing a little bit later, but moving from the baseline risk, which is in the upper left corner, down to the post-wildfire or hypothetical post-wildfire risk in the bottom right. And when you show that risk, there becomes an opportunity to reduce the hazard. So in this case, the regional district is going to use this information to work with the wildfire service to talk about perhaps mitigating the burn likelihood through prescribed burns. So reducing the fuel load in the upslope watershed for those communities that might be disproportionately at risk. So this is the chance that we have to do that hazard reduction measure, and also things like exposure through deflection berms, but also things like policy decisions. Should we allow someone to build in this area? And if they do build in this area, should we have their houses be constructed in a way that they are less vulnerable to damages? So things like concrete first floors, not having bedrooms or windows on the upslope side. And you can do that in that situation where you show that the risk is disproportionately in these more unlikely scenarios. Now, the other thing that we can do for risk reduction is education. And I think this is something that's been stressed. But where we do see fatalities in these rare circumstances for smaller events is often because someone is in a place where they shouldn't be. Buildings, for the most part, are relatively safe, except for very large debris flows. But if you're out and about, perhaps traveling in a car or as a pedestrian, you're more likely to be trapped in that debris, and your body is way less capable of handling a debris flow than a building is. Don't try and risk it. Matthias was telling me funny stories about how, like, when he was doing his PhD, he actually took a bucket and tried to put it on a rope and then just put it into a debris flow so he could get a sediment concentration. I would not advise that ever, to do something like that in a debris flow. So when we're talking about educating the public, we're telling them about where these safe evacuation zones are, what are the warning signs. And Sophia's developed these really cool graphics that talk about that. And then they're on our website with them under our BGC squared arm. And these are all informed by risk reduction measures and policies that we've seen in other places. And then after a wildfire, I really think we have this opportunity to begin to talk about managing the hazard. And so a couple examples here from up in Canada. On the left, we've got an Indigenous community, Stiapmuk, and then we've got the Shwepmik people on the right. And what they're doing is replanting these forests. We've actually had a mandate change in British Columbia. So we no longer are replanting for tree harvesting values, we're replanting for climate resiliency. And so that's a provincial mandate now. And you work with the Indigenous partners that are in these communities. So we're increasing biodiversity in these places. We're also looking at implementing natural fire breaks in these, so planting more deciduous trees. And so we're taking that knowledge where we've increased the fire risk and trying to turn it on its head in that post-wildfire scenario. And most of these are Indigenous-led initiatives, which is amazing to see. Now, group risk. And I'm going to encourage you all, next time we talk about this, I want a couple more people to say we've done this. But it does get into this concept of willingness to pay. And so Alex and Scott have done some research about what's the government's willingness to pay for risk reduction measures. And this is a concept that's actually used quite widely in the infrastructure field. You can see the example there of guardrails, which are relatively like medium-ish cost. But in the unlikely event of a car accident, having a guardrail reduces the chance of a fatality because you're not having it uncontrolled into a field or a rollover situation. And so if you use this concept of willingness to pay, on average, it's about $8 million the government is willing to pay to reduce risk by one death. So you have to do that in terms of group risk, though. So you have to demonstrate that this is a societal risk reduction measure. Now, we do this on a daily basis. So our willingness to pay on a personal level is, how many of you ride bikes? Okay, good chunk of you. How many of you ride with a helmet? Okay, good. Because what we know is that if you put on a helmet and the unlikely case of an accident, you are going to have less chance of a fatal or perhaps a traumatic brain injury as a result of that. So it's very similar concepts around something that is relatively inexpensive to put together. And most of us hate wearing a helmet. It does something to my hair and I don't like it. But it helps in those very unlikely circumstances. So Alex and Scott have put together this graph that looks at the number. This is an FN diagram. So the likelihood or probability of a certain number of fatalities per year and the number of fatalities that occur, and then look at approximate costs that most governments are willing to put in to save a certain number of lives. And so I would encourage you to think about that and also think about things like economic risks. So if you can demonstrate that you're going to both save lives and economic terms, things like houses or infrastructure, then you can use a graph like this to begin to talk about that willingness to pay concept. So we've done a few of these risk assessments. What are some lessons that we've learned about doing them? There are going to be a few funny things, a few serious things, and then I'm also going to challenge you a little bit to think about things a little differently. And I'm going to echo some of the comments yesterday about social factors. So we'll take a little dive into those. So first things first, risk reduction does not occur in a scientific silo. I'm going to be really nice and say that science is not the answer to our problems. It is part of the toolbox of the solution, but it is not the ultimate answer. So this visual that you can see, it's a really great risk communication publication put together by Stewart that talks about the evolution in terms of risk communication that we've had. So the upper left corner there being a top-down or a more authoritative approach that was more common about 30 years ago or 40 years ago. I would say that a few of you still do it. Just try something different. In which one-way communication is flowing. We've moved now over the past few years to a people-centered approach, so it's a two-way communication, but those groups are still largely in silos. So you talk amongst yourselves, then you decide how to talk to each other. The bottom diagram is something called a risk communication community. So that's deeply integrated. You can see that the decision makers or the authorities are woven throughout that community, and that you've got the scientists, including social scientists, technical experts. You've also got indigenous knowledge holders. You've got the community leaders within there, people who are influential in making these decisions. And you've also got the general support of the global community behind you. This is what I'm finding is a better approach to doing this, particularly in climate change. We're facing larger and larger risks, and when we try and communicate those to the broader community, it is harder to do that without deeply integrating into that community. As scientists, we often are seen as something more of the top left, where we have the answer, we have the number, and we're telling you how bad it is. But in my experience, in working with these communities, telling them that bad news comes at much easier when I understand the pressures that the communities face on a day-to-day basis. So I'm in there, I'm having coffee, I'm having conversation, and I'm working together with the community to understand the risks that they face. No, not yet. Okay, I'm gonna throw myself under, or throw us under the bus here. Okay, so now risk communication. There's cardinal sins that I'm gonna go back to that we've done for a long time. So use science communication best practices. So this is a map of a debris flow runout zone. Our colleagues put this together about 10 or 15 years ago. It's a very busy diagram. It is not clear to me what you're supposed to get out of this diagram. There's roads, there's transmission lines, there's lakes, there's some sort of amorphous blob in the middle of it that's different colors. There's velocities in there with arrows, unclear what that is. And this is what that figure looks like to someone who is red blind. And you'll notice that those colors begin to blend towards that kind of yellow color. Now, color blindness, interestingly, is disproportionately larger in men. And so when you begin to think about the people that you might have had difficult conversations with, are more of them men? And do they understand the colors that you're using to communicate the risk? And that is something we think about quite a lot in terms of our maps. So I'd encourage you to look at organizations like the International Panel on Climate Change, has some really good resources, not only with colors, but also with words, so how we communicate certainty and uncertainty. And also things like Color Brewer are really good resources to be able to know what colors are appropriate for what you're trying to do. Okay, back to cardinal sins. So where possible, avoid qualitative risk assessments. And what I mean there is that you're talking about hazard likelihood, spatial impact probability in terms of words, very low, very high, etc. And what we have found is that if you do a qualitative risk assessment, it is very difficult to compare to other geographies. They're often quite difficult to understand, and they don't have a lot of translation to those real life risks. And the example here that I've got in the upper right corner, just even looking at two different reports, one consultant might say it's a very high risk. What the definition of that very high risk, is it imminent life safety? Is it economic risk? It's not entirely clear when the public reads it. And then words like considerable, what does that word even mean? Where does that fall in terms of the likelihood of that event occurring? We have found, though, that semi-qualitative risk assessments can be useful to roll up understanding. So if you do the quantitative work for, let's say, 500 different areas, and then you roll up that information into either terms of this is relatively higher risk, or this is relatively lower risk in your area, but your fundamental basis is quantitative, it's an easier way to roll up that information. If you have to do qualitative risk assessments, create bins that are meaningful for what you're trying to assess. And what I've seen, and I have done this a lot in the past, is the example on the top there where we talk about likelihoods and we just bin them by statistical likelihood. Maybe we use natural breaks, or maybe we just use classes that seem for us to make sense. But those actual numbers don't have very much meaning. And I'll use this in the context of if we go back to the post-wildfire example. So you saw earlier I said 5-year rainfall and 60% likelihood of basin occurring. And what was the annual likelihood of that occurrence? Do you remember?
1 in 33.
1 in 33 for risk, but the hazard likelihood was about 10%. That's a pretty high number. That's about, if you were talking to someone, it's like a 10-year event or 10-year return period. So that's a really high number. And that doesn't come across when we're binning things into 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60. So use numbers that are translatable to the risk that you're trying to calculate at the end. When you're doing risk assessments, don't overestimate risk, avoid conservatism. So if you're doing this for the first time, grab a buddy, phone a friend that's done it. Don't always assume that it's one. As I pointed out in the beginning, there's a lot of luck, a lot of chance involved in this. And if you do the math towards the end, you either end up with something that's pretty tame or something that's pretty scary. And so when we're trying to make those decisions, we want to make sure that we're using values that make sense and not trying to scare people or fearmonger them into it. Okay. So then the next thing we talk about is specific terms in the risk assessment. So spatial impact likelihood. We use both field evidence and modeling in our risk assessments. Often when we start off these risk assessments, we take the LiDAR and we sit down with it and we draw the map that the end should look like. And in the end, if you've seen a few debris flows or debris floods, and you understand some of the ways that that might be channelized or not channelized, you can pretty much develop a map that's pretty similar to the end outcome. And I would trust a geomorphologist that's looked at a couple hundred debris flows more than someone who is running a HEC-RAS model for the first time in their life. I would trust the risk assessment results from someone doing a field-based approach, looking at evidence of boulders, levees, doing test pitting, than just doing something like a flow runout model. And this example here you can see, this is Matthias. They did a really detailed study of all the boulders in people's yards that they were using for decoration. And they looked at the distribution of those, as well as the size of them, to see how likely it was that a damaging debris flow would go through the community. And you can see on that upper diagram there, I've hidden it with the legend, but the creek actually goes towards the top of the image. And all of those big boulders are pointed right in the path of what we would consider the most likely avulsion location. So it's towards the center of the fan. So if you put on your geomorphologist hat, in the beginning, you want to use a blended approach. You use field evidence and you use runout modeling. And if they're disagreeing with each other, you need to think critically about why that is occurring. So thinking a lot about avulsion scenarios, infrastructure blockages, things that would cause you maybe to try to understand why that's occurring. Now, we're getting more into people that are doing modeling. Awesome. I am not a hydrotechnical engineer. I'm a geologist with a little bit of training. I am not qualified to be able to understand what kind of Froude number we should be using. I have opinions on Manning's N, but I'm not actually very good at it. And so if you told me to run a runout model, I would not actually enjoy that process, nor would it be fairly accurate. So when you're doing runout modeling for the first time, I want you to think a lot about why are you actually doing this modeling, and if the modeling software is the appropriate choice for you. We've begun to use ProDF quite a bit, and we're testing it out in terms of its rapid ability to be able to model runout. But with speed comes a loss of accuracy about flow estimation or depths, and also if you're calibrating to the appropriate event parameters. So thinking a lot about what is the appropriate use case with the modeling package that you're using. And this, again, kind of highlighting Katie's research here around the different modeling softwares and those different inundation extents. What I'll note in here, also really importantly, is that low depths matter. So thinking a lot about the edge case scenarios, about economic damages as well, and how your modeling software may or may not account for those. Once you've got all of those factors, then you can go to life loss vulnerability, so that V factor. And quite often we're comparing this to building damage states. This is an area of ongoing and active research. And I know Katie's been doing a lot of this, we've been doing a little bit of this, but trying to understand what is the chance of somebody dying, or perhaps what is the replacement cost of that building in case of a damaged state. And so we've got fragility curves for that are both related to flow depth and impact pressures. But I will encourage, as a community, we need more data on damage states that are occurring and what the ultimate consequences of those were, either economic or life safety threats. So please collect data, even if it's small. And then just wrapping up here, I've got a few more slides, but life safety risks still exist outside of buildings. And the example here that you can see is a fatality, one of the few fatalities that we've had from post-wildfire debris flows in BC. This was a couple traveling in an antique sports car. They stopped because it was raining and they were going to put up their hood, and they were in the path of a post-wildfire debris flow that pushed the car over the edge. And then the lady that you can see there was killed by that debris flow. So fatality risks still occur outside of buildings. And it's really important when you have those people that are used to living in a post-wildfire area to know about safe zones, evacuation routes, and potentially things like warning systems or perhaps closure criteria. So making sure that we're also accounting for the people that are traveling through there. Now, in the end, Alex's work has shown that there's really no universal life safety risk or tolerance criteria. And in a lot of communities that I work for, we're thinking also about the relative safety of being in a house that might be in a hazard zone is better than the risks that somebody face if they're unhoused. And I have had to take a step back and take off my scientist brain and say this risk is unacceptable, and begin to think about socioeconomic factors. So having someone in a house is sometimes better than not having someone in a house at all. And so each person is weighing these different categories. If they're living in a hazardous area, the economic opportunities that are given to them, typically agricultural especially, and then that connection and personal safety and closeness and community. And thinking about those things when we're trying to evaluate whether or not someone is at risk of these events. We also have to think about intangible consequences and how important those are. So things like fear, thinking about if you're designing an evacuation procedure, how often that's going to be triggered and how much that might stress people out. We're thinking about food security issues as well, so traditional food harvesting and whether or not you may be able to access those. We have to integrate these better into our risk assessment procedures. And then last, a lot of what Alex has talked about is about risk reduction work. Reducing risk isn't always wise. There are costs that are associated with reducing risks that we sometimes understand and sometimes we don't. So very off of the head, it's things like money. You're diverting those initiatives from healthcare. There's lots of opportunities if you build a $10 million structure, but beside that, are you thinking about those people who might be not able to, that community might no longer be able to afford things like road maintenance, wear and tear on vehicles, and there are always cost trade-offs for those. We have also got an opportunity cost with land sterilization, so actually purchasing that land. The communities that I work with talk a lot about evacuations, about how a prolonged removal from the community is harder on a person than trying to move them into somewhere else in the community that is less affected by the hazard. We've also got a loss of personal safety and connection if you're out of your home, particularly for prolonged evacuations. We've got loss of livelihood, so you're going to be then affected by other socioeconomic issues, things like destruction of fish habitat. And then I think COVID has also really importantly shown us about things about society, about the disproportionate risks that people face. And sometimes when you go through all that math, that number is very, very low. And so when the society doesn't see that event happening, it begins to place mistrust in us as scientists. So things like I've lived here forever, or perhaps the government's trying to influence us. So you have to weigh all of these things together when you're talking about risk reduction measures. So I'm going to end here with a bit of a summary. So risk assessment, I would encourage you to do it. Go beyond hazard and into risk. And don't just think about life safety. If you can, get to economic as well. And if you really are deeply integrated into the community, consider non-tangible values. It's a deeply fundamental, and I've learned so much about being in a community, understanding the risks that they face and what their concerns are. Risks can be quantified for life safety, ecological, and other consequences, and I think this is a space that this community has a lot to learn, especially from the ecology community. And always try and quantify those risks within reasonable values. Don't be really conservative about them. Make your best guess. In Canada, at least, what I'm estimating is that post-wildfire risk is maybe 10 to 100 times what it would normally be under non-wildfire threats. And that use that risk assessment to move towards a management policy that's appropriate in terms of the costs as well as the benefits of it. And then lastly, this idea around a risk tolerance criteria for individuals is really not working out for us. When we set these values way too low, we're trying to achieve something that's pretty much impossible. And so encouraging you to begin to think about, especially if you've got smaller communities, thinking about their risk tolerance and how it might fit into the risks that they face every day. And then that's it. I'm gonna give you my references. I know we all care about these things, but mostly just go read Alex's work. Thank you.